The first thing you need to know is that I never expected to hear his voice. Not really. For weeks, maybe months, I'd watched him shrink into the corners of his own life, always in his wife's shadow, never getting a word in, not even a simple yes or no. He would sit quietly in his hospital bed, hands folded, eyes cast down, while his wife answered every question for him, fussed over every detail, and made sure he stayed silent. I'd seen that kind of silence before, the kind that isn't just about shyness or frailty, but something deeper, something that settles in the bones after years of being overlooked or maybe overruled. I'd bring him his medicine, check his vitals, and ask him how he was feeling, but every time she would jump in, her voice sharp and certain, as if she was afraid of what he might say if given the chance. There's a rhythm to these hospital nights, a hush that falls over the ward after visiting hours, when the lights dim and the world outside fades away. That's when you see people as they really are, stripped of all the little performances we put on for each other. I've spent more nights than I can count walking these halls, listening to the soft beeping of monitors, the distant coughs, the quiet prayers whispered into darkness. It's in those hours that secrets sometimes slip out, when people are too tired to keep them locked away. I've held hands with the dying, wiped tears from the cheeks of the grieving, and heard confessions that would make your heart ache. But nothing prepared me for what happened that night. It was late, past midnight, maybe closer to 2 in the morning. The ward was quiet, most of the other patients asleep. The only sounds the hum of the air conditioning and the soft shuffle of my shoes on the linoleum. I was doing my rounds, checking on everyone one last time before the shift change. When I reached his room, his wife was finally asleep in the chair beside him, her head tilted back, mouth slightly open, a magazine slipping from her lap. He was awake, though, staring at the ceiling, his face caught in the pale blue glow of the monitor. I paused in the doorway, not wanting to disturb them, but he turned his head and looked right at me. There was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before, a kind of pleading or maybe desperation. I stepped inside as quietly as I could and whispered his name. He didn't answer at first, just kept looking at me, his lips pressed together like he was holding back a flood. I sat down on the edge of the bed, careful not to wake his wife, and took his hand in mine. His skin was thin and cool, the veins standing out like blue rivers beneath the surface. I told him it was all right, that he could talk to me, that whatever it was, I would listen. And then, in a voice so soft I had to lean in close to hear, he began to speak. At first, it was just a few words, halting and uncertain, but then the dam broke, and the truth came pouring out. What he told me in that moment changed everything I thought I knew about people, about marriage, about the secrets we keep for love or for fear. My hand shook. My heart, worn and heavy after so many years, crumbled under the weight of what he finally told me. I've seen a lot in my time, miracles, heartbreak, the best and worst of what people can be, but some truths can still break you, no matter how strong you think you are. My name is Rose, and after all I've seen in these hospital halls, I thought I was prepared for anything. I was wrong. Sometimes the quietest voices carry the heaviest burdens, and sometimes when you finally listen, your whole world changes in a single fragile moment. I remember that day so clearly, as if the echoes of it still linger in the fluorescent-lit corridors. The hospital had that heavy smell of antiseptic and old coffee, the kind that seeps into your skin after years of double shifts. It was early spring, and the rain tapped gently against the windows, a soft, steady rhythm that matched my own tired heartbeat. I'd been on the night shift for almost a decade by then, and though you never truly get used to the darkness, you learn to find a kind of peace in it. The world quiets down, and the chaos of daylight softens into something gentler, though no less urgent. That evening, as I tied my hair back and slipped my feet into my worn white shoes, I felt the usual mixture of fatigue and resolve settle over me.
It's a strange comfort, the way the routine wraps around you, even as you brace yourself for whatever the night might bring. The ward was a patchwork of lives. Old men with trembling hands reaching for the past, young women clutching hope like a lifeline, families perched on the edge of sleep in uncomfortable chairs. I'd seen so many faces blur together over the years, but some always stood out. That night, my first stop was room 212, the room with the couple everyone noticed. He was called Walter, a gentleman with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to hold entire stories behind them. His wife, Virginia, was rarely more than a few steps from his side. She was always brisk, always alert, answering for him as if each question from the staff was a threat she needed to deflect. Their dynamic was a quiet storm, her voice filling the space, his presence shrinking with each passing day. I made my rounds, checking on Mr. Ernest down the hall, who always asked for 2 sugars in his tea and told me stories of his days as a carpenter, though his memory often tangled the years. I stopped by to see Mia, a little girl with a stubborn cough and a smile that refused to be dimmed by illness. Each patient carried their own burdens, and as I moved from bed to bed, I tried to leave a bit of comfort behind. A gentle word, a cool hand on a fevered brow, a promise that they weren't alone. But something in room 212 pulled at me, a tension that lingered long after I left their doorway. Nights in the hospital reveal as much about the staff as they do about the patients. My fellow nurse, Donna, was working that shift with me. She was younger, full of bright energy, and the kind of hope I remembered having when I first started. We would exchange glances across the nurses' station, sharing silent jokes and little worries, always checking in with each other. There's a camaraderie that builds over shared exhaustion and the unspoken understanding that, in this place, you carry the weight of other people's lives in your hands. That night, though, I found myself returning again and again to thoughts of Walter and Virginia. Something felt unsettled, as if I was watching a play where the script was written in invisible ink. So much left unsaid, so much tension beneath the surface. As the hours crept by, I busied myself with charts and medications, the small rituals that keep a ward running. But every time I passed room 212, I could feel Virginia's eyes on me, protective, almost suspicious, as if she feared I might somehow upset the fragile balance she had built around her husband. And Walter, he would glance up, only for a second, and then cast his gaze downward, shrinking into himself. I'd seen patients like him before, men whose voices had grown quiet from years of being overshadowed. But there was something different about Walter. Something that made my heart ache with a mixture of empathy and helplessness. I wondered what he would say if given the chance, what stories he carried locked away behind that silent facade. I checked on them one last time before midnight. Virginia was reading aloud from a book, her tone brisk and efficient, while Walter listened with a faint, resigned smile. I offered to bring them tea, and Virginia replied for both of them, declining politely but firmly. As I left, I caught Walter's eye, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something flicker there, a silent plea, a longing for connection. It stayed with me through the rest of my rounds, a gentle reminder that sometimes the greatest pain isn't physical, but the ache of words left unspoken. That ache, I now realize, is often the heaviest burden we carry in these halls. The hours after midnight, I always say, are when the hospital truly reveals its soul. That night, as I moved softly along the rows of half-lit rooms, I found myself listening for things that weren't said as much as for the usual alarms and coughs. There's a certain stillness that settles, not just in the building, but in the people themselves, a kind of surrender to the vulnerability of night when the masks and the brave faces start to slip. I saw it everywhere. Ernest murmuring in his sleep about the house he built for his wife long ago, Mia's mother humming lullabies to calm her daughter through another fitful hour, and Donna, my fellow nurse, pausing to take a breath by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass like tears she didn't dare shed at work.
These were the quiet, ordinary moments that made up our nights, and yet, beneath the surface, I felt a tension building that I couldn't quite explain, a sense that something important was waiting to be uncovered. I kept circling back to room 212, drawn by the energy that seemed to thicken the air around Walter and Virginia. With every visit, I tried to catch Walter's eye, to offer him a smile or a gentle touch, hoping he might meet me halfway. But always Virginia was there, her words swift and sure, her attention fixed on maintaining order, her tone making it clear there was little space for anyone else's voice. She would ask about his medication, quiz me on his chart, and answer my questions before Walter could even part his lips. I'd seen love take many forms in this hospital, but rarely had I seen it so tightly wound, so controlling, as if she believed that speaking for him was the only way to keep him safe. Sometimes I wondered if it was fear or habit, or maybe a pain she herself had never learned how to voice. That night, Donna caught me lingering outside their door and gave me a knowing look. "You worry too much, Rose," she whispered, but I could see the concern in her eyes, too. There's a language among nurses, a way of seeing things that others might miss. We notice the tremor in a patient's hand, the way their shoulders hunch when someone steps into the room, the tiny flinches and glances that tell stories words never could. Walter was telling me something every time he lowered his eyes or pressed his lips together, but it was a language I hadn't yet learned to translate. I wondered what his silence was costing him and what it was protecting. I wondered, too, if Virginia ever wished he would speak or if she was too afraid of what he might say. I think of all the times over the years when patients have confided in me, sometimes with words, sometimes with nothing more than a trembling hand or a lingering look. I've learned to listen with my whole body, to lean into the pauses and the silences, to honor the stories people are too tired or too scared to tell out loud. That night, I felt the weight of that listening more than ever. As I checked the IVs and adjusted blankets, I found myself longing to reach through the silence that wrapped itself around Walter. I wanted to assure him that he was seen, that his story mattered, even if it was buried beneath years of unspoken words. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming a gentle rhythm on the rooftop, as if echoing the quiet ache in my chest. The hospital felt like a lifeboat adrift in a storm, each of us clinging to whatever hope or routine we could find. I paused for a moment by the supply closet, pressing my hand to my heart, whispering a small prayer for courage, for myself, for Walter, for everyone weighed down by secrets and silence. I know that so many of you listening now have carried your own burdens, have watched someone you love retreat into themselves, have wondered how to bridge the distance that silence builds. If you're hearing this, if you've ever felt alone in a room full of people or longed for someone to truly listen, I'd be honored to hear from you. Tell me where you're from, or share a piece of your own story in the comments below. Sometimes reaching out is the bravest thing we can do. Something shifted the moment the clock passed 2 in the morning. There's always a point in each shift when fatigue and routine settle in, when you think you've seen the worst of it for the night. But then, without warning, the atmosphere changes. That night, it was as if the air itself thickened. The hum of the monitors grew louder, and every light in the hallway seemed harsh against the deep shadows. I had just finished checking on Mr. Ernest, who was finally resting easy, and was about to sit for a moment at the nurse's station, when Donna came rushing down the hall, her eyes wide and voice urgent but hushed. "Rose, it's Walter. Something's wrong." I hurried with her to room 212, my heart pounding in my chest. The years of experience doing little to quell that old fear that comes when you sense a crisis. Virginia was standing beside the bed, her face pale and drawn, but her mouth set in a tight line that told me she was holding herself together by sheer will. Walter looked worse than I had ever seen him. His breathing was shallow and ragged, his hands trembling on top of the covers. The monitor beside him showed a heart rate that dipped dangerously, and for a moment I thought we might lose him right then and there.
I spoke his name, softly but firmly, and his eyes fluttered open, finding mine, as if he'd been waiting all night for someone to see him. Virginia immediately began to speak, her words a rapid-fire stream of explanations and apologies. She told me he'd been sleeping fitfully, that he'd refused his medication, that maybe he was confused, maybe he was just tired. But I could see something else in her eyes. A flicker of panic, yes, but also something like desperation. She clung to the foot of the bed, her fingers white around the rails, her body blocking any chance for Walter to reach out. For a moment, the room was filled with a tension so sharp it made my hands ache. I stepped to Walter's side, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, and asked Virginia to give us a moment of privacy so I could check his vitals and help him settle. She hesitated, her eyes darting from me to Walter and back again, but at last she nodded, stepping just outside the door but leaving it open a crack. I could feel her presence hovering, unwilling to surrender control even for a few minutes. Alone with Walter, I bent close, whispering words of comfort, telling him he was safe and that I was there for him. His breathing steadied just enough for him to squeeze my hand. It was then that he tried to speak, his lips barely moving, the effort immense. I leaned in, brushing a stray hair from his forehead, and told him to take his time. The look he gave me was filled with a kind of sorrow I've only seen a handful of times in my career, an aching, desperate need to be heard before it was too late. As I checked his pulse and adjusted his oxygen, I realized that this was the moment everything had been building towards. The silent tension between husband and wife, the longing in Walter's eyes, the tightness in Virginia's voice. The truth was so close I could feel it pressing against the walls of that little hospital room. I stayed with him, my own heart pounding, and waited for him to find the words he needed to say. In that moment, all the noise of the hospital fell away, and it was just the two of us, suspended in a fragile hush, the weight of decades pressing down on us both. I remember thinking, as I watched his lips tremble and his eyes fill with tears, that sometimes the hardest thing in the world is to let someone speak their truth, especially when you know it might change everything. The silence between us was thick with all the things that had never been said, and I could feel the years of his life pressing in, begging for release. I took his hand in both of mine, steady and warm, and promised him, in a whisper only he could hear, that I would listen, no matter what he needed to say. That promise, simple as it was, seemed to give him a little strength. He drew a shaky breath, and for the first time since I'd met him, I saw a flicker of hope in his eyes, fragile but real. The night had broken open, and there was no turning back. The moment I found myself alone with Walter, I sensed the storm beneath his silence, a storm that had been brewing for years, maybe decades. His breathing was uneven, rattling in his chest, and as I listened to the faint beep of the monitor, I realized how fragile life could be in these late hours. I'd seen patients rally at the edge of morning, and I'd seen them fade quietly into the dark. But with Walter, there was a tension in the air, a sense that something desperately needed to be said before the dawn came, something that might explain all the years of quiet and fear. He squeezed my hand with surprising strength for a man so worn down. His eyes, dull with exhaustion, found mine and clung there, searching for forgiveness or maybe just understanding. I leaned closer, feeling Virginia's presence just outside the cracked door, her form a shadow against the hallway light. There was urgency in the way Walter's lips moved, trying to shape words that seemed to stick in his throat. I encouraged him gently, telling him that whatever it was, he could trust me. I had seen so many secrets spill out in this hospital, from confessions of guilt to pleas for mercy, but the pain I saw in his eyes was different. It was the pain of someone who had never been allowed to speak his own truth. Finally, between ragged breaths, Walter began, his voice so faint I had to lean in until his words brushed my cheek. He told me about the years of silence, how Virginia had always spoken for him, how every attempt to assert himself was met with correction or dismissal. He spoke of the loneliness, the endless ache of being invisible, even to those who claimed to love you most. He admitted that he had started to believe he had nothing worth saying, that his feelings and memories were burdens too heavy for anyone else to carry. As he spoke, tears welled in his eyes and spilled onto the thin hospital pillow. I whispered that he was safe now, that he could say anything, and I would carry it with him just for this moment. But there was more, something deeper. Walter's hand trembled as he confessed the secret he and Virginia had been hiding all these years, a truth so heavy it almost seemed to press the breath out of him. His words faltered, then spilled out in a rush. Their only son, Daniel, had died many years ago in a car accident, but Virginia had never allowed Walter to grieve. She had shut the world out, banished Daniel's name from their home, and forced Walter to swallow his sorrow, pretending for the world that he was never there. Walter's voice broke as he told me how he would sit alone in their son's room, holding the boy's favorite book, longing to speak Daniel's name, to share his memories and his pain. But Virginia had insisted that silence was the only way to survive. She had built walls around her grief, and in doing so had walled Walter out, leaving him stranded in a sea of unspoken love and loss. As he spoke, I felt the tears burning in my own eyes. I squeezed his hand tighter, letting him know that I heard him, that someone finally saw his pain. The weight of all those years, the missed birthdays, the quiet dinners, the nights spent lying awake beside a woman who had turned away from the world, settled over us both. I realized in that moment how tragic it is when love is twisted by fear, when the loss of a child becomes the loss of a marriage, and two souls drift apart in the silence. I wanted to tell him that he was brave, that speaking the truth, even at the edge of life, is an act of hope. But the words caught in my throat, and all I could do was hold his hand, share his sorrow, and promise him that he was not alone in his grief. The beeping of the monitor, the hush of the ward, the distant sound of rain against the window, all of it faded into the background as Walter finally let himself cry. He grieved not just for Daniel, but for all the years he'd been denied his own voice. And in that moment, I grieved with him. I've carried many stories in my heart, but none as heavy as this one. If you're listening and you've ever held back your pain for the sake of someone else, know that you're not alone. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to let the truth out, even if it shakes the walls we've built to protect ourselves. And if you feel moved by this story, if you carry a secret of your own, I invite you. Subscribe, join this community, and share your story below. We're all searching for a place to be heard. The moments after Walter's confession felt like standing in the eye of a storm, utterly quiet, yet with the air still charged by everything that had just passed between us. I sat there, holding his trembling hand, my own heart heavy with the weight of his story. The monitor's beeps faded into a kind of hush that filled the room, and I could hear only the sound of his breathing, ragged but growing steadier, as if the act of speaking his truth had released some invisible chain that had bound him for so long. I wiped his tears gently, smoothing the damp hair from his forehead, and whispered that he was safe, that he had finally been heard. His relief was visible, a softening of his features, a faint spark of gratitude in his eyes that reminded me why I do this work, night after night. Virginia lingered just outside the door, and I could sense her unease, the way she shifted on her feet, uncertain whether to come in or stay away. I realized then that she too had carried her own kind of suffering, her silence a shield, her need for control a desperate attempt to keep her world from falling apart. I stepped out for a moment and met her gaze, trying to offer the smallest comfort. I told her Walter was resting, that he was safe for now, and that sometimes letting someone speak their pain is the only way to begin healing. She looked at me as if she wanted to believe it, but fear still flickered across her face. I've seen that look so many times. A person standing on the edge of change, terrified of what might happen if they let go of their old ways, even though those ways have hurt them for years. Returning to Walter, I found him with his eyes closed, a tear still clinging to his cheek, but his mouth finally relaxed, as if the years of holding back had exhausted him. I sat with him in the hush, listening to the rain outside, letting him rest in the knowledge that at least one person in this world knew his secret and honored it. In those moments, the ward felt different to me, as if some of the sadness had been lifted, if only for a little while. I thought of all the patients I'd cared for, all the things they'd never said, and I wondered how many lives might have turned out differently if only they'd been given the chance to speak. When the shift changed and the morning nurses came in, I gave a quiet report, choosing my words carefully. I told them only what they needed to know, respecting Walter's privacy, but I made sure to say he might be fragile that day, that he needed gentle care. Donna squeezed my shoulder with understanding, and I saw in her eyes the promise that she would watch over him as I had. There's a quiet solidarity among nurses, an unspoken vow to protect the vulnerable, to keep their stories safe, even as we move on to the next patient, the next crisis. I left the ward that morning with a deep ache in my chest, but also a sense of peace. The world outside was washed clean by the night's rain, and as I stepped into the gray dawn, I felt the weight of Walter's story settle into my bones, a new layer in the tapestry of memories I carry. It's never easy to bear witness to someone else's pain, to sit in the darkness with them and wait for the light. But as I walked to my car, shoes squeaking on the wet pavement, I understood that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply listen, without judgment or interruption, and hold space for another soul to unburden itself. To those of you still with me who have listened to this story all the way through, I thank you from the bottom of my heart. If you've ever found yourself carrying the weight of unspoken pain, or if you've been the one who finally dared to speak, you know how much courage that takes. If you haven't yet, maybe today is the day you let someone in, or offer to listen to a friend or a loved one who has grown too quiet. And if you feel moved by Walter's story, please consider subscribing and sharing your own stories in the comments below. We all need to know that we are not alone, that our voices matter, no matter how long they've been silent. When the dawn finally crept across the city, filtering through the hospital's grimy windows, everything felt quieter, softer, as if the world itself held its breath in honor of the night's confessions. I walked back into room 212 just as the sun touched the foot of Walter's bed. He was sleeping, his face more peaceful than I'd ever seen it, the lines of worry and regret less pronounced, as if letting the truth out had eased a burden so heavy it had pressed down on him for years. Virginia was there too, sitting in her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes red-rimmed and distant. She looked up at me, and for a moment we simply regarded one another, two women who had spent a lifetime navigating the fragile edges of loss and love, control and surrender. I saw something in her then, a vulnerability that she had hidden behind her briskness, a longing to be forgiven, or maybe just to be understood. I moved quietly, checking Walter's pulse, smoothing his blanket, all the while feeling the weight of what had transpired between us. For so long, I'd believed that my job was just about medicine, about tending to wounds and counting pills, but in moments like these, I understood that healing often had nothing to do with the body. It was about bearing witness, about giving someone the space to speak what had never been spoken, about tending to wounds that no stethoscope could ever find. I glanced at Virginia, and I saw the rawness in her, the exhaustion, the fear, but also something softer, perhaps the beginning of acceptance. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. I nodded, and she nodded back. Sometimes that's all there is to offer after a lifetime of silence, the simple acknowledgement that the truth has finally been named.
The shift change came, and I handed Walter's care over to Donna, quietly explaining that he might need more gentle attention that morning. Donna squeezed my hand, her young grip full of the compassion I recognized in my own younger self. As I gathered my things, I found myself pausing in the hallway, listening to the familiar symphony of the ward. Nurses laughing, stretchers rattling, the radio humming in the distance. But I also knew that somewhere in one small room, a man and his wife were learning how to live with honesty, maybe for the first time in decades. Walking to my car beneath the pale morning sky, I felt the fatigue in my bones, the ache of so many years and so many stories carried home from work. But alongside that tiredness was a quiet pride. I had done what I was meant to do. I had listened, and I had held space for someone's pain. I thought about all the times I'd been too tired, too busy, too lost in my own worries to really see someone. I thought of all the voices that go unheard in this world, all the hearts that break in silence because no one stops to listen. I promised myself, as I watched the sun glimmer on the wet pavement, that I would not let that happen on my watch, not if I could help it. There's a kind of grace in witnessing someone else's truth, even when it's hard, even when you know it will haunt you. I drove home with Walter's story settling somewhere deep inside me, another thread in the tapestry of my life as a nurse. It's a heavy tapestry, but a beautiful one, woven from both sorrow and hope. I hope, if you're listening now, that you understand the power you hold simply by being present, by being willing to listen. Sometimes that's all anyone needs to begin healing. Sometimes it's enough. As the morning took over from the long, dark night, I carried Walter and Virginia with me, and I hoped they would find peace. I thought of all the people I'd cared for over the years, all the secrets I'd been trusted to keep, and I realized that each story, each confession, each moment of honesty was a kind of light in the darkness. And I hope you do too, wherever you are and whatever silence you're trying to break. If you've made it this far with me, know that you are not alone. There is always someone willing to listen, always a chance for a new beginning, even after the longest night. Now you know how it all happened, how a man's voice, silenced for so many years, finally broke through the hush of a hospital night and changed not only his world, but mine as well. I wish I could tell you that after that night, everything was fixed, that Walter and Virginia found a perfect peace and never struggled again. But life, as I've learned through decades of tending wounds and holding hands in the dark, is rarely so simple. Healing is a slow, uneven thing. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply to begin. Still, I saw something shift in that small, dimly lit room. A seed of hope, fragile but real, planted in the soil of shared pain and finally spoken truth. I watched as Virginia, her face drawn with exhaustion and regret, reached for Walter's hand. Not to silence him, not to guide him, but to simply hold it. In that quiet gesture, I saw the beginning of forgiveness, the first trembling steps toward a new way of loving each other. For days after, I checked in on them, sometimes just standing quietly in the doorway, sometimes sitting at Walter's bedside, listening to the gentle rhythm of his breath. Virginia spoke less, but when she did, her words were softer, and I noticed she listened more. Walter, for his part, seemed lighter, as if the act of sharing his grief had loosened the chains that had bound him for so long. He even smiled at me once, a small, tired smile, but one that spoke of gratitude and relief. I realized then that sometimes the greatest healing comes not from medicine or machines, but from being seen, from being heard, from knowing that your pain matters to someone else. I carried their story with me, as I have carried so many others, letting it settle into the tapestry of my memory. Each patient, each confession, each midnight conversation has changed me,
teaching me that the human heart is both fragile and resilient, capable of breaking and mending over and over again. I thought of all the times I'd been too tired or too busy to truly listen, and I promised myself that I would do better, that I would make room for the stories that needed telling, no matter how heavy or uncomfortable they might be. If you find yourself, like Walter, holding on to words for too long, afraid of what they might bring, I hope you remember that you are not alone. There is always someone who will listen, always a light in the darkness, even if it's just a tired nurse at the end of her shift. And if you're the one sitting beside a loved one, holding their hand, uncertain and afraid, know that letting them speak, even if it hurts, may be the greatest kindness you'll ever offer. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is to bear witness to another's pain, to hold space for their truth, and to trust that, in time, even the deepest wounds can begin to heal. As I close this story, I offer you the same promise I made to Walter. I will listen. I hope you'll do the same for those around you. Share your story. Hold space for another. Let your voice be heard, or be the ear that someone else needs. This world is too heavy for any of us to carry alone. That's what I've learned after a lifetime of midnight confessions and quiet miracles. Thank you for walking with me through this long night. May you find the courage to speak, the grace to listen, and the peace that comes when silence finally gives way to truth. And if you carry a story in your heart, know that it matters. You matter. We all do in the end.